Hello, this is Clinton and Hillary, and welcome to Blacklannic, a podcast and media channel bringing East Coast voices to the world.
This week, we will be speaking with Jennifer Dow. Jennifer is related to friends of the show, actually, Tondaway and Mary Louise McCarthy, and I believe is going to be our resident expert today about the apology that Justin Trudeau gave in Nova Scotia this week about the number 2 Battalion. And we'll be speaking more about this because I am definitely far from knowing a ton about it.
If we have time, we'll also throw in some commentary on Russell Peters' live stand-up show. And just so everyone knows, our podcast is weekly with guests or topics, and you can find us anywhere online by searching Blacklannic. I want to say that we're super happy to be on CHMA every week, as well as if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button and please subscribe.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm tired. I'm different background and not the good camera because although I could have done that, I'm realizing, but I'm in Ottawa for Blues Fest and hanging out with my dad and my stepmom, which is nice. It's definitely the suburbs and a much different vibe than the usual Toronto life, but nice to catch some really good live music and concerts. So that's been my week so far. What about you?
I'm good. We've just working on the house. Business is super busy. Went out to see Russell Peters last night in Moncton, so I've got some commentary about that.
Yes.
And just really trying to do stuff this summer. Everyone's been so locked up for the past 2 years that I'm just taking advantage of every opportunity to get out and about.
That's fair. Me too.
Yeah.
So we're ready to bring in Jennifer.
Let's do it.
All right. So we are here with Jennifer, our guest, which we've already introduced. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Awesome. So we'll start off like before we get into the battalion and the real reason you're here, like tell us a little bit about you, what you do and your connection to us, I guess, and why we have you on.
Well, I'm a genealogist and family historian. I'm also 6th and 7th, depending on which side of my tree you look at, generation Black New Brunswicker. My ancestors came, most of them with the Loyalists in 1783. So I'm just carrying on my own family tradition of being the knowledge keeper and making sure that this history is preserved for future generations.
It's amazing. So you've 6 or 7 generations in New Brunswick of history there. That's incredible. It's amazing to know how far back your bloodline goes and sort of the stories and interesting things that take place, and especially in situations like this where we have a prime minister coming to the east coast of Canada to make apologies to Nova Scotianers, which I think there's a bit of something there to discuss, not New Brunswickers and stuff like that. So what is your whole involvement in the event that took place last week with Justin Trudeau traveling to Nova Scotia to apologize to the Battalion number 2 for their involvement in the army and them not getting the proper recognition? And how does that relate to you specifically? And
so my great uncle, so my great grandmother's brother, was bandmaster sergeant, I believe it was called, of the number 2 construction battalion band.
okay.
I also had many cousins. I'm related to the Tyler brothers that both served. And through the family trees, we were very close knit in New Brunswick. So I have many different cousins that had served throughout the battalion. So my cousin Mary Louise McCarthy Brandt wasn't able to attend, so I attended on behalf of Reach in New Brunswick because I sit on the board with her in that organization.
And just briefly for the people who don't know, because I know that we've shared articles about it, but if you wanted to explain briefly like what Reach is and does so that other people can go look in that before we get back into the battalion.
Sure. So Reach in New Brunswick, so it stands for Remembering Each African Cemetery's History in New Brunswick. So this was kind of the brainchild and came out of Dr. McCarthy Brandt's PhD dissertation. And her and I have worked closely together over the years because I have also done research on a gravesite that is on a property that my mom grew up on, that my family had been on since the early 1800s. So we kind of collaborated on this when she started the organization. And so we do a lot of work to research and preserve Black cemeteries in New Brunswick, but it's also finding all that history, all those family connections that, because like being a genealogist, I want to know who everybody is, who they're connected to. And so our database is compiling all of that information to preserve it.
That's amazing. And if I remember correctly, some of it came to the forefront of the news because there was a cemetery that's underwater, and Dr. Mary Louise McCarthy was looking for a very specific apology, and that was sort of the last, I think, that we shared about it, right?
Yeah, and that apology still has not come. They did put a new monument there, but I mean, that story there, like they didn't even have the names correct. The list of names that they had, I had 3 people that I could prove were buried in other cemeteries, 2 of them in the United States. So like they didn't even take the care to get the names right of who was actually buried there. So this is one of those cemeteries that we have some names, but both Mary and I feel that there's a lot more buried there than were even listed.
That's insane.
It is.
Wow. So why was the apology necessary?
The apology was necessary because at the onset of World War I, Black men throughout Canada tried to enlist, and they were turned away. We have letters from here in New Brunswick of New Brunswick men that were turned away on the basis of them being Black. So it was left up to the leadership of each regiment or each battalion at the time, and whether they would accept Black Canadians or not. And most of them were turned away. There was some that did serve in white regiments, but very few in comparison, to white soldiers that served. So right out the get-go, they weren't allowed. Yeah, that's the list. Right off the get-go, they weren't allowed to serve. And then their idea was to create a segregated battalion. And just their treatment, even their homecoming, like they didn't get the recognition that the white soldiers did. White soldiers came back and they were the heroes, and that didn't happen for the Black community. So, their memory has been something that the descendants have been carrying on for all of these years.
Yeah,
So
imagine that.
yeah.
Imagine, regardless of what they ended up having them doing, imagine being willing to put your life on the line for the country you live in, a country that doesn't even love you, especially in the 1915.
And
To have to fight to be accepted, go over there, help,
yeah,
and come back and get no recognition. I mean, that happened a lot in the States and Canada. You get treated like a hero over there, and during certain different wars, even the Vietnam Wars, and even before that, and then come back here and you still get treated like garbage. So this is one of the letters that you sent us, and the gentleman literally said, I rejected them because they are Negroes, and I didn't feel it would be fair to literally, basically, white people to be forced to serve with Black people. And there's also this allegation that some of them smelled of liquor when they showed up.
yeah. And I mean, I don't know, obviously, I wasn't there, so I have no idea about that, but I'm sure at that time it was not a surprise for anyone, any man to show up smelling of liquor.
Having a beer or something, yeah.
It was, yeah. And the names on that previous list, like those are names, most of those men did enlist in the number 2 construction battalion. One of the men listed on there, Percy Richards, many of his descendants have gone on to, even now, present day, he has great grandsons that are currently serving in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yes, yeah, we saw that as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically this type of segregation and this treatment and this racism went on not just in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And yet, from what I gather, the problem is that Justin Trudeau goes to Nova Scotia, makes an apology to Nova Scotians, but as you're highlighting, there are not only were there New Brunswickers who were a part of this, there is a lineage of New Brunswickers who are still participating in the Canadian Armed Forces, still in the war, still putting their life on the line for this country. And do I understand correctly that the crux of the whole problem is they are essentially being ignored?
Yeah, and I mean that was, I can see, like I can understand, because I found it mostly in the media coverage that it was all about Nova Scotia. Me being there, I mean, I had my fellow New Brunswick descendants that I seen, so I felt represented there. But I mean, they didn't even name the woman that was sitting next to the Prime Minister. I mean, there's so many photos of her. She was on live TV, and she's the daughter of a New Brunswick soldier. She lives in New Brunswick. They didn't even, introduce her or introduce, say her name. But it was made all about Nova Scotia, but that is so common with all of our Black history here in New Brunswick. All of it. We're just automatically lumped in with Nova Scotia, no matter what it is. They forget we exist. But I mean, when it came to this, it was very much Nova Scotia centered. And you had soldiers from throughout Canada, the US, and the Caribbean that enlisted in the number 2 construction battalion. And most of them, like I said, they weren't mentioned. New Brunswick, I don't think was mentioned at all during any of the speeches. But yeah, it was very much centered in talking about the Black history in Nova Scotia, the many centuries of Black history. And I'm like, well, we're right next door, and our history is just as long.
I've been
So,
Go on. Sorry.
oh, no, you go ahead.
I've been finding that really shocking because having been born and raised in Toronto, I will be honest in saying that, like, we're not as bad as Americans, but we don't necessarily know the geography of the rest of the country. We know west of Ontario, but we don't know too much about east. We know PEI, and we don't know Nova Scotia. And I've always known there were Black people in Nova Scotia. And my parents moved to New Brunswick in 1999, and I didn't come out here till 2009, although I visited. And it wasn't until 2010 that I even learned there were Black people in New Brunswick. I learned that there were Black people in St. John, and that was like there was a community and a culture and everything like that. I was completely unaware of that. And I find that, yeah, there's definitely a tradition of that, of highlighting the first Black people in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and their history and their rich culture. And New Brunswick always just gets the sort of the short end of the stick. And even more so reflected in this event that happened in 2022 in July. Just no acknowledgement of the rich Black cultural history that also took place in New Brunswick as early as the late 1700s.
Yeah, I hear it. I mean, I've grown up in New Brunswick and I've heard it my entire life here. Um, you know, Especially once I got into, like, I took over my mom's research and I started doing this work, even more people are like, "Oh, well, I didn't know there was Black people in New Brunswick that long ago." I've even had people, I had one arrogant guy, I was working at a convenience store and there was something to do with Black history on the front page of the newspaper. And this guy looks at the paper and he's like, "Oh, well, most Black people in Canada snuck in here," meaning the Underground Railroad. And so, me being the historian I am, I'm like, And I schooled him that night on Black history in New Brunswick because, like, I've grown up with it. Like, we know we're here, but we've always kept our history very um, close to our chest, I think. And that's one of the things, like, we've always been closed off. My great grandmother always had this thing about, because, she'd say, like, she would say the white people, they want to curl their hair like us, they want to tan like us, but they don't even like us. They just want to steal our things. And that was her thing. And so even our history, even our stories, we keep close to our chest because of that, because people will steal them and a lot of the time get them wrong, because that's another thing I do. I spend a lot of time just trying to correct a lot of the errors in New Brunswick Black history.
So you
Um,
feel, sorry, Hillary. So you feel like in the Black New Brunswick community that has been here for so long, that they're a tight knit community, and they keep it that way for fear of their culture being
Well,
appropriated or stolen or taken.
at one time they were very tight knit. As the generations have gone on, especially like my generation, we're not as tight knit as we used to be, or as our ancestors were. Um, But even with our own histories, like we don't like typically share with, for lack of a better word, I'll say outsiders, because, you know, so often they steal our history. We have white academics that are wanting to publish books or, you know, do their master's degree based off of our history. And half, you know, so half the time they either don't get it right, or they don't even, like, they only briefly consult the community. They just want our information, and that's as far as like that it goes. And then they just do what they want, say what they want about our history.
Mm.
I was just going to say briefly that a friend of the show who's an archivist, Meredith Batt, actually mailed to me the book Blacks in New Brunswick that I believe Tonduay had a hand in a republication of it and had a forward in it for anyone listening who wanted some like a good brief information, I believe up until like the 60s or 70s about Black people coming to New Brunswick and like being given land that was purposefully bad and their mistreatment and everything. Because as I mentioned to you, Jennifer, before we did the podcast, like 28 years old, went to school in New Brunswick, born and raised in New Brunswick, learned about Black people in New Brunswick doing this podcast in my mid to late 20s and not in school or beforehand. And my other comment also being that during Black History Month this year, when Dialogue New Brunswick had Blaine Higgs speak, he also blanketed over the history. So again, and we say this, I think, on Black Atlantic often enough, erasure in New Brunswick is the number one like racist crime, is just pretending that there is no Black history. And so I don't find it shocking that the media would lump New Brunswick in with Nova Scotia, because our own premier is even just like, there was racism once, and then we had Wiley O'Ree and happy Black History Month. And I'm like, because that's what happened. Yeah, thanks, Blaine.
They have like this set of like this handful of people that they know to mention, and they mention those people over and over and over and over and over again. And I'm like, of course, I know so many names. I'm like, well, you could, like, there's so many other amazing people from the community. And it's funny you mentioned the reprint of the Blacks in New Brunswick, because all except for 2 of the photos on that cover are from my family's collection.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, there's one that's almost in the center. It's a like a picture of a family. My mom is in that picture. My great grandmother's on that cover. My grandfather's on that cover. Yeah, and they're all Black New Brunswickers.
That's cool. I will look at it when I get to my real home and not this one. I will re-examine you and look at your family.
That is so interesting. But so what does the apology mean? What does the apology change anything for the people involved who received it?
It doesn't change anything, because apologies don't. I was actually really concerned going into this, because just prior to this apology, in Halifax, they held the Royal Nova Scotia International Tattoo, and my husband's military, so my husband goes down for that every year. And this year they were doing a special tribute to the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And I had my doubts, because this is like, I had my doubts that they were going to honor it properly. And I was very disappointed, because I had bought a ticket to the live stream, because where my husband was already away, I couldn't go. And at the ending, so they play a video, and then at the ending, you're supposed to have it's supposed to be the soldiers. So it was like the reenactors, but they were all descendants of No. 2 Construction Battalion soldiers that are currently serving in one of the 3 branches of the Canadian Armed Forces. To me, as a descendant and a military spouse, like, that was a big moment. They didn't even show them. They showed the band that was walking ahead of them, which was mostly white people, but they didn't show those soldiers. And I was so disappointed. And they didn't even post anything, like any sneak peeks. They did it for so many other performers. They didn't even post anything until I messaged them and I said, hey, I'd like to share something. I know you're doing a tribute. Can you post something? And it was after that they actually posted something on social media. So going into this apology, I wasn't expecting much. But I will say, from the speeches, they didn't gloss over things. They laid it out exactly how those men were treated, and they acknowledged that. Because that was my big thing, is that they were just going to gloss over all of the facts. But I mean, the apology itself doesn't change anything. And there was one of the speeches that was given, it's actually the son of Senator Calvin Ruck, and Calvin Ruck wrote the book about the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and I believe it was published in 1987. And in his speech, he basically said, this is a good start, and we're going to continue watching you. You know, this is a start. And I think that's what it was, is this is the first step. This isn't just an apology and that's it.
And in that vein, so because there was the apology, and I just like, then they also announced that they're like, the Canadian Mint would have a coin that is like dedicated. Does that add anything? Because my feeling is always this discomfort when there's like an apology, and either there's like a token item or financial repercussions given, because it's never enough. Like, you can offer money to people who have suffered. It's never like resources or mental health aid. It's never, to me, a grandiose enough thing to really represent what people have gone through. And I find it often, it's just like it's a symbol, it's a token, it sort of dumbs down the situation, it makes it feel a lot smaller than it is. So I'm curious, feedback from someone, you know, related to this whole situation. Like, does the coin help at all, or is that just another, okay, great?
Yeah, to me, it's a okay, that's nice. Like, the coin doesn't do anything for me. Now, like, I see this as the first step, because they did announce that. So what happens is, since the No. 2 Construction Battalion doesn't exist anymore, a currently set up regiment or battalion has to carry on the battle honor that they were given. So that's going to be carried on by 4 ESR, 4 Engineer Support Group here and that's based out of Base Gagetown. And so one of the announcements is that they'll be naming, I think, a carpentry shop after the No. 2 Construction Battalion. So that's something that's going to live on. And so for me, that is good. And I briefly I say harassed, but I made it known who I was to the person from the Engineers Museum here on base that was there, because I want to see if they're going to do something, that they're going to have a permanent display for the No. 2 Construction Battalion. You know, because like, that's the biggest thing, is because they called this battalion Canada's best kept secret. Because even the defense minister, in her speech, she's from Kentville, Nova Scotia. She said she did not know of this battalion until she became defense minister. And I think that was only like, what, last year or the year before? And I'm going, how? I mean, I know that, yes, it was in my family. That's why I knew about it. I'm like, but how did you not hear about it at all? Like, it's just, you know, especially someone in that position, a politician from Nova Scotia. I'm like, you would have thought that you should have known. So for me, it means a lot when they're doing things to ensure that the memory of these soldiers will carry on, and that people won't just forget that they existed.
Yeah, you'd think there'd be plaques and monuments or statues of some sort. Thank you so much for your input and your information on the subject that even us, we didn't know enough about. Can you tell us, Jennifer, a little bit more about what life is like for you growing up in New Brunswick, and any of your stories or experiences you'd like to share?
For me, growing up in New Brunswick, I grew up, in part, my mom is Black, so I grew up as part of the Black community. I loved it when I was younger, because we had a lot of the elders that were still around. So I grew up having the opportunity to be around these elders, to be around like the older women that just knew who everybody was, who they married, who they were dating, all of the little gossips and all, you know, all of that. We had our annual Black picnic at French Lake. That was once upon a time a huge thing. You had like families like the Eatman family, the McCartys, the Howes, Palmers, like everybody that just came to these. So for me, it was, I mean, it was good. I went through a stage as a teenager though, because I look the way I do, that there was always that awkward moment when, you know, my mom would walk up to me, or I'd show up somewhere with my mom, and everyone would just go, "Oh, your mom's Black." And I'm like, I didn't think I needed that tattooed on my face. Like, I don't know why everyone seems so surprised by this, but it was like,
Mm.
and so I didn't do anything with Black history back when my mom was doing it, when I was in like my late teens, early 20s, because I was going through that awkward stage where I just didn't know what to say when people were always pointing out this. And yeah, and then I got married, I had kids, and I'm like, oh wow, somebody's got to do this work now, you know, like it's and I started doing, I guess, the history thing. But no, overall, I mean, for me growing up in New Brunswick, it was okay. I knew my history, nobody else did, because it wasn't taught in school here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And being a genealogist, it's not just for, is it just for Black genealogy, or is it,
No,
how does a job like that work?
um, I do it for, like, I've done it for all different branches. So my grandmother, I have a grandmother that's Acadian, so I've gone into the Acadian trees, and wow, they're huge. Um, I'm just gonna say that. And I've dabbled in all different parts. I mean, I generally concentrate on the Black community because I've studied it so long, and I use a lot of the oral histories that I'm able to piece it together that way. So I use a mixture of like traditional genealogical research combined with oral history, and then add on even DNA, because I've dabbled with like looking into DNA matches, and I have a knack for researching, so I've been able to find adoptive parents or children, or figure out whose people's parents are, usually accidentally, but
That's super cool.
Yeah.
I find it
yeah.
very interesting. I was literally speaking to being the Acadian tree on my side today, of someone telling me that I'm actually related to someone else, a different Melanson on another side. And I was like, I bet. Sure, all of the Melansons are related. Only two came from France. So I think that's great. And I also do I definitely understand from like a reverse perspective, having a white mom who gave birth to me at 43, the look of like, is this your grandmother? Did she adopt you? How did you come to be here with this old white lady? And me being like, nah, that's my mom. Thank you.
Yeah, it was always like, and it was always two different reactions I would get. So from the white community or white friends, it would be like, oh, your mom is Black. Like they're all surprised, like it's a thing or something. If it was the Black community, like if I had a Black friend and they're like, oh, your mom's Black, and then we were like BFF after that, like I was family. And it was just like such a like complete polar opposite reaction that I would get. It was very, very interesting.
Of course, because then you're included into, like you were explaining, that tight knit community, and I definitely get that. I can understand that like feeling of apprehension, and then being like, oh, you understand. You're invited to the cookout. You understand where we're coming from and what our lives have been like, as opposed to, like you were saying before, that like outsider
Yeah.
mentality.
And that was like the apology. One of my favorite things about it was being able to be there with other descendants. Like that for me is what did it. Like that, the entire atmosphere, it felt like it was put on by the Black community, and that the prime minister, the defense minister, all the other dignitaries, they were the Black community's guest on that day. Like it wasn't their event, and it was like it was very spiritual in a way, the entire event that way. Like it was like I explained it as like I felt like I was home being there. And just even the music, like they had a beautiful singer from Nova Scotia that sang, and like all of it. It just like it felt like home to me. I was like, I wish I had this in New Brunswick.
Well, good. I'm glad that you got that feeling. And I'm glad that Justin Trudeau had to feel like a guest somewhere, as he should. Awesome. So thank you again so much for coming on and educating us and our guests. If anyone wants to know more about you and also about Reach and what you're doing with Dr. Mary Louise McCarthy Brand, if you wanted to just plug that information now so people can get a hold of you and the good work you're doing.
Well, if anyone wants to reach out to us, they can always send us an email. Our email is info@reachnb.com.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for coming on.
I was just saying thank you so much, for coming on the show, Jennifer. And it was very insightful to hear this information and learn from you today.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was Jennifer Dow, and that was an awesome segment we just had on getting more information about the number 2 Battalion. And we are hoping that during our topic episode weeks, we can actually start to get more guests to divulge us with information and insight that our ignorant asses probably wouldn't have on our own.
We're smart about the things that we're smart about, but we don't know everything. And we also don't know all of the Black experiences. And I think it's important, I agree, to have people who can speak on expert topics and not just a whole episode about who they are. But I also thought that Jennifer was very, very interesting, much like Mary Louise and Tonduay. So I am not surprised. Their family is just so rich with history, and I really like that.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, so we have one more topic to discuss tonight, and it has to do with stand-up comedy. So Russell Peters came to Moncton last night, which was July 13th. Huge crowd, as he pointed out himself, pretty much 100% a white crowd. A few people of color, and he pointed them out as well. But I didn't know this about Russell Peters. I know this part. So Russell Peters is an East Indian individual who grew up in the Brampton region. So, you can claim Toronto if he wants to because he's famous. He's international. Once you're internationally famous, you could be from like Whitby and you can claim Toronto, and it's all good. But he is an East Indian individual who often in many of his stand-up episodes likes to let people know that he grew up around a number of Black people, around a number of Jamaicans, because when he was born in, or when he moved to Canada in the 60s and 70s, white people were very mean to him. They were very racist. He was treated with extreme racism, and so the Black people didn't treat him badly. They didn't bully him, they didn't beat him up, they weren't racist against him, they accepted him into his communities. However, I was not aware that Russell Peters likes to use the N-word on stage. So during myself sitting in this audience of 99.9% white people last night, and after hearing his whole bit about the use of the N-word, how white people can't use it, the kind of agreement that had been made between Black people and white people, like his bit was, we're going to give you this word, you can do whatever you want with it. Black people saying like, well, we can do whatever we want with it. We can do it, like we can make our own rules. Yes, the rules are like, you can't use it, we can use it whenever we want. If you use it, we're gonna fuck you up, and stuff like that. And like, do you like rap? Yeah. Ha 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 ha. Well, yeah, you're gonna get in trouble for that. And then he goes on to talking about other terms that people aren't allowed to use anymore, and those are terms like, I'm just quoting here, like retard or idiot or the C word, which he said, but I'm not going to say, even though we're allowed to swear on this podcast, I'm not going to say right now.
Cunt?
Yeah, you got it. And then he was talking to his brother and their relationship, and he was making jokes, and he was saying how he would have nothing to speak to his brother about if he couldn't use those words. So then he was pretending he was on the phone with his brother, and he called him like gay and a retard and a nigger. So I was shocked. I felt in that moment confused, uncomfortable, angry, interested in how he felt he could get away with it. Because when we walked in, they said like no phones, no cameras, it's a Netflix special. And I felt it was, I know I don't expect him to know about Moncton or New Brunswick. He's a global comedian. He's like top 10 in the world. But in a province like this with so much racial issues, even the entire audience, there was a really uncomfortable, nervous laugh. And afterwards, he was silent and just looked around. And he goes into this whole thing about comedy and how, like, F you if you're offended by comedy. Um, there was probably other parts that people would have got offended at during the show as well. And if that comes out on Netflix, people will see that. But I just wanted to say that, he is East Indian and he feels very comfortable using the word. And he also likes to point out that he knows Black people, which is not too far from being on par with, like, well, I'm not racist. I've got 3 Black friends. So that happened. And I've been talking to some of my friends about it. And I wanted to know how you feel about it. Like, can Russell Peters use the N-word? He was saying he wasn't going to use it because he didn't want to end his career, and then he used it. But
I have a lot.
I was uncomfortable for a while. Sorry, I asked you a question, but hold on. And I was laughing like crazy beforehand, and I was kind of like for a while, and then I started laughing again a little while after that. But can Russell Peters use the N-word?
No. So I have a series of thoughts. Thought number one is baffled that they are going to use the version filmed from the Centre Avenir Center for a Netflix special.
Well, for Netflix, what they do is they record every show he does. They record it. And then when you're watching a Netflix special, you're usually not watching one performance. They're piecing together the best segments of when he had the most energy, or when he got the best audience reaction, or when some heckler didn't interrupt him, or blah, 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 blah. Like, there was a lot of local Moncton stuff that he said that I know is not going to make the Netflix special.
Okay, that makes me feel better about the idea of just like Moncton being broadcast to Netflix. But then that was also going to be my point, as to like, I do feel that there would be some onus to, if you're going to joke about, like, make Moncton specific comedy, to understand at least a little bit about what people you're telling racist jokes to. By and large, no. Like, I first of all have a very hard time with when Black people use the word, because I do think it encourages white people to use the N-word in the same way that I think the reclamation of bitch and cunt encourages other people to use those words, in the same way that I don't think he should have used gay. Like, I have a problem with all of the words, not just the N-word, because I think the more that you use it, the more that other people around you think it is okay to use, and they put it in their vernacular without thinking about how that affects people at large, whether it makes our population and community just dumber by using those words, as opposed to the words they actually mean to evoke emotions like, I'm frustrated, that person is not giving me what I want, I am displeased, etc. Those are what these words represent, and they are not those words. They are hurting people actively. So I do, first of all, think all of the words a no-go. It does sound very much like tokenizing the fact that you know Black people and you grew up in Brampton to use these words when you yourself, you're a color, but you're not Black. Like, you are not a nigga, so why you saying it hard R? You're not. That to me is a hard no. And then my last thought is, in the same, I believe I said the same thing about Dave Chappelle with the comedy special about the queer community and the trans community. Comedy does not transcend harm. You can say things that hurt people, and I don't care if you think it's funny. I don't think if you're paid by Netflix, I don't care if it's supposed to be a joke. If people can be harmed by the things that you say, there should be some form of repercussion. Joe Rogan losing like Spotify money would have been another example of when this type of shit goes too far. I'm not saying that Russell Peters saying the N-word is going to cause white people in the audience to, like, I don't know, put burning crosses on someone's lawn, but it certainly doesn't evoke kindness. It's not a nice thing to say to a community that is already sometimes tense, and a community that does not treat Black people well, or Indigenous people well, or many of the people that are any color well. So for me, it's a no on all fronts.
It feels like a no for me as well. There were many jokes made that, people from New Brunswick could have said, oh, he should have been more in tune with the situation in New Brunswick and what sensitivities in New Brunswick and this, that, and the other. Um, but I disagree with that particular aspect because, again, this guy is an international celebrity. You can't expect, like, it's like when this huge rock band, they're doing their global tour and they can't remember the name of the city they're in. Well, I mean, they're superstars, but you're right. He doesn't. It just didn't feel. It felt really wrong. And I mean, there's examples in culture of people who are not black per se using the word and getting away with it. And I will say that while I use it a lot less than I used to, I am of the opinion that black people can use it. And when I've used it in the past with me and my friends, or they've called me that, like, I find it as a term of endearment, or sometimes it's an insulting term, like in rap music, you're using it to insult people. Like it can be used in 100 different ways. So I'm not saying that, like, I see that it can be damaging, and I'm not necessarily saying, but I don't think that we shouldn't use it because I'm not saying we shouldn't use it because white people have a problem with us using it. If black people have a problem with other black people using it, that does create a fair argument. But you've got rappers like Saint Joe, Fat Joe, who is a Puerto Rican rapper who grew up in the Bronx. And he's used it his whole life, and he's actually gotten away with it. And he's got very light skin. He's Puerto Rican. He may have some kind of black heritage, but he's using it in commercial recordings, and it's okay. No one has called him on it. Like, there are certain people that have gotten a pass. I just don't feel like, when did Russell Peters get that pass? And how does growing up in Brampton, like, he makes fun of everyone. He's similar to like the Simpsons or Family Guy back in the day, in which it's hard to call them racist against one particular group because they literally make fun of everything and everyone. But growing up in Brampton around a number of different cultures, including black people, it just felt wrong. I can tell you, sitting in that chair, it felt wrong. But I know there were a lot of other things from that show that many other people would have been highly offended about as well. Like, he was not being PC in any way whatsoever. He was talking about older generations older than him, and he's 52 years old, mind you. And how they were so politically incorrect. And then he went on to be very politically incorrect on a number of other matters that people would bring up as politically incorrect nowadays, like the LGBTQ community and stuff like that, and a couple other things. So, like, really, it's hard to really contextualize, like, what is going to happen. But I feel like I would like to see if it shows up in the Netflix special, because he's not black. He's a stand-up comedian who said he wasn't going to use the word, then used it. And I did a bit of research, and he has, I've seen, I saw other skits with him this morning in which he used it. I've even talked to some black people I know about it, and they were like, well, what was the context? So it seems among certain people in the black community that there is sometimes situations where people have been allowed to use it. Like, one thing I've always said my whole life is that, if you have a white kid that grew up in the projects, and I mean like the real projects where it's like 100% black people, and you don't get exposed to outside culture, maybe even before internet, 100% black people, and there's this white kid and he grew up in the projects. And if within your closed knit communities, if everyone around you is using that word and they're calling you that word, and they allow you to use that word, and you're using it in a closed context community, maybe that's okay in some circumstances. But if that same person became Eminem or an international celebrity, and they're talking to strangers and people all over the world in the internet, Netflix, or traveling every city, every town, just because you can use it with your friends in private, which, again, I'm not saying everyone can do, I don't think you should be able to use it on stage in front of 3,000 white people when you're East Indian, telling white people that only black people can use the word, and then you use the word. It didn't track well for me. I am a Russell Peters fan, but that didn't track well at all. Does
I
that
think
add like any different? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, like, in the context that you provided about, like, hypothetically, if the white person surrounded by that Black community would then become famous, at a certain point, you should have, like, the white person would have people telling them not to use the word. I think it's because of the fact that Russell Peters is a race that is not white, that there is this question of, can just blanket people of color use this word and not Black people? And I personally think no. Like, as I said before, I'm of the opinion that I sort of wish Black people would less, because it encourages so many other people to use it in these ways that are unfair, unless it is Black people around other Black people. Definitely don't think just blanket terminology, people of color should use it. And I do, like I said before, in that same vein, like, I would have had a very big problem as well with all of the other words used as well. As someone who also identifies as gay and a woman, I don't like this version of woke comedy that is trying to be so pushing the boundary that it's funny, because it's not funny. To me, it just comes off as stupid. I don't understand the whole point of, like, I'm going to make jokes with every single thing I shouldn't say to basically get negative press, to make people watch it to see how bad it really was, to still get the views and the clicks, because negative press is still press, and upset a bunch of people for what? To still make my money and ha ha ha, I won. Like, it's not funny. If the point is comedy, it's not comedy. If the point is being jarring and disrupting to make money and to get clicks, congratulations, you did it. Because now all these people are going to be like, well, did Netflix actually let him say the N-word? And they're going to go watch. But so cool, you got your bag, but I don't know that you're like a comedian. Like, that's not comedy. That to me is stupid.
Yeah, I hear you. Like, comedy has changed a lot in what's allowed. I mean, that always was comedy. That was always comedy growing up. I don't know how much comedy you watched when you were younger, because you're younger than me, and like, that was comedy. Comedy was shocking and in your face and offensive. Again, just to talk about TV, like not Simpsons, like South Park and Family Guy and every stand-up comedian. Like, you go back and watch stand-up comedy from 10 years ago, and my God, it was offensive. And yeah, it's around 2016 or so, there started to be a lot more rules in comedy. But he himself, yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is how he feels. Like, he himself admits that he's an asshole and he's a jerk, and like, F you if I don't. And that's, a lot of comedians have that perspective. But it was, like, again, ironic to hear him talk about the older generations and how they were politically incorrect, and then talking about how we had to create political correctness because of the generations older than him, and then go on to be like, okay, but here's where we draw the line on political correctness. And he's talking about gender and race and stuff like that. He definitely catered to, like, a very conservative crowd that was in there, and he may or may not be a conservative, who knows. But at the same time, I laughed a hell of a lot, and I laughed afterwards as well. I mean, like, I've watched many comedy shows that were offensive back in the day, and I laughed because, again, they make fun of everybody. But
I
I
mean,
definitely didn't like sitting in that audience surrounded by white people and hearing him use it, though. That's for sure.
I will say, in terms of like what I was saying about like shock value and being offensive, I don't like the point of like talking about political correctness to be offensive. If a joke, like, I've watched
Yeah.
Jimmy Carr, I think, would be considered like pretty offensive, but I don't think that he makes the butt of the joke the I am anti-political correctness. I think that overt, like, pointing the finger at the problem and then being the problem is stupid, whereas as opposed to just being offensive. In the Dave Chappelle special that like disrupted the whole world, I did laugh before it started to be a little transphobic, and I laughed after as well in the same way, because they're like, comedy can still be comedy, and you can still, like, in the same way that people can still listen to Chris Brown, you can separate the art from the artist, and you can have a problem with the moment that they use the N-word, but then still find the 20 minutes after that to be funny. And because you're in the room, you're still going to laugh. You're not all of a sudden going to be stone cold because of that moment. But at the same time, I definitely would have been beside you in that discomfort, especially, like I said, for all of the other terms used as well.
Yeah.
So no
I mean,
dice.
and you mentioned person of color. I mean, if that was the case, like, where would you draw the line? I mean, he's a person of color and he's brown because he's East Indian, but could a Korean person use that term?
That's exactly my question. I
Chinese
don't
person
think
use
so.
that term? Yeah, probably not. Probably not.
I don't think so. Having
No,
people
I'll
start
say
saying
no.
the
I'll say no, they
N-word?
couldn't.
No.
Yeah, I'll say no, they could not.
No.
So yeah, and I mean, the other point is, you're right. Like, I mean, is he doing it just for the shock value? Would I have suggested we speak about this tonight on the show if he didn't use that word? I would have just in the intro been like, I saw Russell Peters, it was really funny, let's get on with the show. So is he trying to mimic the Dave Chappelle route and get like a lot of sensational drama surrounding the Netflix special if he comes out as saying that this and what happens? And again, I've liked Russell Peters for years. I didn't even realize that he used it because I went back and I found a clip from like 5 or 6 years ago in which he was using it multiple times in his skit. So that it's really weird. And that's all I'll say. I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on it. Again, I've been chatting about it with some of my friends, and there was some mixed reviews there. Like, who can, like, we thought it was pretty clear who can, whether you should or shouldn't use it. We think it's been pretty clear on who can use it. But this is sort of pushing that boundary. And the last thing I'll say about comedy is that comedy actually has been successful in creating conversations in society over the years that no one else has been able to create, because it's a platform where you can push the boundaries and say things and talk about things that people wouldn't feel comfortable talking about in a regular setting. So I feel like comedy has pushed society forward in a lot of ways, but is now at a point where some of it's just too much.
That's how I felt about the Dave Chappelle thing as well, that there could have been some, and I think there probably were some really great constructive conversations around the Black community, the queer community, the queer white community, the queer Black community, and how they should potentially be working to help each other. But I do think that obviously you can't tell Russell Peters or Dave Chappelle, hey, this is how you should go about facilitating this conversation, because they're going to make the jokes that they want to make. It's up to the people who listen to the comedy and ingest that type of media to then facilitate the right conversations. But I do agree that I think that he shouldn't have said the N-word. He's not Black. point blank, that's my opinion. But I would also be interested to hear what other people have to say. Like, do people from Brampton just get a card? Is any person of color from Brampton immediately allowed an N-word pass? Because I didn't think so.
That's a good question. That's a good question. It really is. So yeah, anyone listening, let us know your thoughts. Don't let us know your thoughts by using the word, but it's certainly one of the most unique and interesting words in the English language, in as far as the rules surrounding a single English word goes. But yeah, so that's our show for today, I believe. Justin Trudeau traveling out to Nova Scotia to apologize for some atrocities of the past, and an atrocity that may have taken place just yesterday here in New Brunswick.
Atrocities abound.
If you haven't already, please go over to Black Planet on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your music, wherever you follow social media, TikTok, and give us a like and a follow. If you're watching it on YouTube, hit that like and subscribe button. You can find Hillary at Cropberry, and of course myself. It's very simple, Clinton Davis. If you want to get in touch with us, message us at Black Planet as well. And anything else, Hillary?
Donate to our GoFundMe. We've received more funds and we're very, very grateful, and we like to pay our contributors. And if you want to be a contributor and help us make more Black content, let us know. Send that to our email too, blackpanic@gmail.com. Hit us up.
Hit us up. All right. Peace.
Bye.